In the spring of 1942, massive convoys left Iceland headed for the ports of the Soviet Union. The Russians needed everything: supplies, ammunition, weapons, tanks, and airplanes. So the Allied sailors took all kinds of risks by traveling across the Arctic Ocean along maritime routes that took them past the coasts of Norway and Denmark, both under Nazi occupation. When the Germans had reached a standstill in front of Moscow and Leningrad and were preparing to attack Stalingrad, the German forces had one single obsession: stopping the Allied convoys at any cost. Waves of Luftwaffe bombers and U-boats descended on their prey. One of the convoys involved in this fight, codenamed PQ-17, was the victim of the greatest maritime disaster of World War II. When Operation Barbarossa began, nearly 4 million men, including 3 million Germans, 4,300 tanks and more than 4,300 airplanes, crossed the Soviet frontier, throwing the Red Army into chaos. Just a few days after launching the attack, the Führer was in a very good mood. To his closest advisors, he said, "The enemy has nearly lost the war. It's a good thing that we destroyed their tanks and their air forces right from the start. The Russians can't replace them anymore." By the fall of 1941, the Germans had destroyed an estimated 20,000 tanks and 35,000 pieces of artillery. They were just 25 kilometers from the center of Moscow. The Soviet government had their backs against the wall.
In October 1941, a joint English-American mission set off to the Kremlin to accept the astronomical demands of Stalin, who was calling for supply convoys to be sent to the Soviet Union. This would be the largest operation of its kind ever imagined, intended to transport tons of supplies, airplanes, ammunition, and tanks to the Russian ports at any cost.
A single cargo ship could carry 10,000 tons of 39mm cannons, 37 tanks, 100 trucks, 3,800 tires, 4,000 cans of lard, 1,200 tons of sheet metal, 10,000 bags of dry beans, and 9,000 packages of canned meat. Yet the whole load could be sent to the bottom of the sea by a single torpedo. In order to get these supplies to the front as quickly as possible, the Allies decided to take the maritime routes to Murmansk and Arkhangelsk by the way of Greenland and the Barents Sea. The convoys would leave from either Iceland or the WWII base in northern Scotland. Depending on the conditions of the ice, they would sail either north or south of Bear Island, through a narrow passage between Svalbard and the Norwegian coast. The convoys were aiming for the ports of Murmansk, Arkhangelsk, and Molotovsk. The crossing could take anywhere from 10 to 14 days.
The leaders of Nazi Germany weren't expecting Great Britain to help the USSR because they were convinced that Churchill hated them. They could have never imagined such a show of solidarity, but they had forgotten Churchill's words that Great Britain had neither eternal allies nor perpetual enemies, only eternal and perpetual interests. They neglected to take that into account. That's why the first convoy sent out in 1941 made it through. They took the Germans by surprise, and the crossing went smoothly.
By the end of 1941, 48 Allied ships had already taken the North Cape route and delivered 2,373 vehicles, 481 tanks, 705 airplanes, and nearly 87,000 tons of ammunition and 25,000 tons of fuel. For the British sailors in charge of these convoys, this cooperation was only natural.
I think that everybody that served on the Russian convoys felt that they was doing the right thing to help the right people.
But we also knew that the thorn in the German side was the equipment. You were providing the men and the women. The Americans and the British, we were supplying the guns and the tanks and all the machinery of war through the Arctic Convoy, which was a good combination, really, because it worked.
The first few crossings might have been spared a German response, but the crews still had to deal with the Arctic climate.
The Arctic is a very funny term because sometimes the weather was raging torrent, it was terribly rough sea, and at other times it was as smooth as a duck pond.
North of the Arctic Circle, periods of bad weather are very common. In winter, the ships were sailing through a near continuous night.
We were dealing not only with the Germans, but also with the elements. The Barents Sea is never calm.
The ships were constantly rolling. The water was very cold and aggressive, and we were always being buffeted by the waves. When I arrived on board the destroyer, it was very difficult, but I soldiered on. We had a job to do, and I never complained to anyone.
All true sailors fear hurricanes and snowstorms. Only madmen aren't afraid of them. Sailors have always feared them. But on the Arctic convoys, everyone, even the Soviet atheists, were praying to God to send them a storm and create fog. When it was stormy or foggy, none of the airplanes or the submarines dared to come out.
In winter, the bridges and superstructures were buffeted by enormous waves. When the temperatures dropped, the ships were covered in a thick layer of ice, freezing the turrets in place and paralyzing their weapon systems. That ice had to be removed at any cost because it could cause boats to tip. Right from the start, it was a fight to the death, and the natural elements which were out of control in late winter 1942 made things even harder. The gates of the Arctic were synonymous with the gates of hell. Task Force 39, American reinforcements sent to relieve the Royal Navy, which was occupied elsewhere, lost one of its admirals to the storm. March 26, 1942. The battleship Washington was battered by waves as high as a 4-story building. Despite its 35,000 tons, the ship was tossed around as if it weighed no more than a feather.
Admiral Wilcox arrived on the gangway of the Washington, just as an enormous wave washed over the bridge. The witnesses saw the water reach the level of his waist and literally carry him overboard. Obviously, everyone on the ship jumped into action, but despite all their searching, given the darkness of the night and the wildness of the sea, his body was never found. the U.S. Navy lost one of their admirals in a matter of seconds.
The maritime route to Russia quickly became a veritable ordeal for the Allied naval forces. The convoys had to be protected, but the Soviet fleet was unable to provide an effective defense with only 8 destroyers. The British naval forces were more powerful, but they lacked aircraft carriers and escort ships. In the game of chess that was taking place in the Barents Sea, there was a severe lack of pawns. They were off to a rough start, and the worst was yet to come. At the start of 1942, Adolf Hitler got involved. The Fuhrer began to show interest in the Nordic theater of operations. He wanted to reinforce his position in Sweden, which was rich in iron ore, and Norway, where he could cut off the route to the north. To him and his general staff, it was out of the question to let Russia benefit from the resources of the Anglo-Saxon arsenal. As a result, Admiral Reeder led some 20 U-boats to the frigid waters of the Arctic, but that wasn't all. He also dispatched most of the German land forces to Trondheim and Narvik. In May 1941, Goering had sent 260 torpedo bombers and fighter jets to the airfields of Petsamo, Kirkenes, Banak, Tromsø, and Bardufoss. Their range extended well south of Spitsberg, which meant it covered the entire zone the convoys would have to cross. The Scharnhorst and the Gneisenau battlecruisers were joined by heavy cruisers Prinz Eugen and Hipper and Deutschland-class heavy cruiser Scheer. This powerful fleet was commanded by Bismarck-class battleship the Tirpitz. The Tirpitz, which was launched with great ceremony by Nazi dignitaries led by Hitler on April 1, 1939, was a 251-meter-long giant weighing more than 50,000 tons when fully loaded, all powered by an engine of over 163,000 horsepower. The vessel's main weapon system was composed of 8 380mm cannons divided into 4 two-piece turrets. The secondary artillery included 12 150mm cannons spread across 6 turrets and 16 105mm twin-mounted pieces, as well as 16 37mm anti-aircraft cannons and 80 20mm rapid-fire guns. The Tirpitz's armor could withstand every kind of artillery shell that existed at the time. An armored shell ranging from 12 to 20 centimeters thick, protected by the essential parts of the ship. This protective armor was more than 32 centimeters thick at the waterline. The bridge was also equipped to defend against aerial attacks.
The arrival of the Tirpitz in the region was an event of great importance. In terms of speed, armor, and firepower, with its 8 380mm cannons, it outclassed every ship in the British Navy, even the most recent. The Tirpitz was a veritable predator.
Even though the Tirpitz had not actually got involved just yet, the Arctic Convoys were having more and more trouble getting through. In early spring 1942, the Germans were becoming increasingly precise. By then, the dive bombers and torpedo bombers were better than ever at reaching their targets. Their coordination with submarines was also becoming more effective. Yet despite the risks, the largest convoy ever launched by the Allies set off from the coast of Iceland on June 27, 1941. Its code name was PQ-17. The next day, the Germans launched a major offensive targeting the petroleum wells of the Caucasus region, including one city whose name would go down in World War II history, Stalingrad. The Russians and the Germans faced off there for months. 2 million people, civilians and soldiers alike, died. Thousands of tons of supplies and ammunition were used. For the Soviets, the already important Allied support became critical.
Yeah, we were all pleased to help. We were on the same side.
The PQ-17 convoy was composed of 36 cargo ships with a close escort of 3 minesweepers, 6 destroyers, 4 corvettes, 2 anti-aircraft cruisers, and 4 armed trawlers, including the HMS Ayrshire, commanded by Joseph Anthony Leo Gradwell, an extraordinary captain who would have many people talking about him in the weeks to come.
Most of the sailors on the Arctic convoys were civilians on ships that had been requisitioned. Gradwell was a volunteer officer, but the only qualification he had was a certification for sailing recreational vessels near the coast. Essentially, he knew how to go around in circles on a yacht, but that was about it.
The PQ-17 convoy was protected by 2 covering forces. The close escort consisted of 4 cruisers and 3 destroyers. Distant cover was provided by 2 commercial liners, 2 cruisers, an aircraft carrier, and 12 destroyers. Finally, a barrier of 8 submarines, including the French submarine Minerve, monitored Norway's northern coastline.
PQ-17 was a vast naval operation, undoubtedly the most important of World War II.
When he saw the cargo ships of the PQ-17 convoy going by, actor Douglas Fairbanks Jr., who was an officer on the USS Wichita at the time, wrote, "They looked like so many dirty ducks floating about on the water. Everyone who saw the motley crew of tubs go by said a prayer." After being alerted by the Kriegsmarine Information Services that the convoy had set sail, Germany's General Staff established a complex plan of attack involving airplanes, subs, and surface ships. It was time for the Tirpitz to make its grand entrance. But its twin brother, the Bismarck, had been lost the previous year. The admirals of the Reich knew how vulnerable these enormous battleships were to attack from the air. As a result, the Tirpitz would only get involved on the direct orders of the High Command and Hitler himself.
In spring 1942, the situation was very unusual. On one side, there were the English and American forces that were there without really being there, because they didn't want to risk their own ships, but they would have liked to have taken the Tirpitz as a hunting trophy. On the other side, you had the Germans, who had complete and total control of the air and sea, as well as having the Tirpitz, which was an enormous ship that could sink any other without even seeing it, but which they didn't want to put at risk either. Hitler was afraid of losing the Tirpitz like he had lost the Bismarck the previous year. And then there were the Russian forces, whose fleet had been greatly reduced, but who were desperate for supplies, and therefore needed the convoys to reach them safely, no matter the cost.
We didn't think about anything, especially not death. All we thought about was the number of airplanes, anchor points, and ships we could destroy. We thought of nothing else.
After 5 days at sea, the PQ-17 convoy was spotted by a German reconnaissance plane. 2 U-boats were already in its wake, patiently waiting their turn. 2 others arrived as reinforcements.
A single U-boat on its own was already dangerous enough, but they were even more powerful when they went hunting as a group with other U-boats.
It was perpetual daylight, and we were going through the Arctic, the Arctic, where the snow line comes down, you know, and it's a very narrow strip that you've got to go through, where there's northern Norway, and then the great ice flow, and you've got to get through that. Well, the Germans knew that, and they used to their submarines used to lie in wait, sort of, so as they come through, they torpedoed the merchant ships.
The Germans even set up a barrier of 6 more U-boats further east. There were now some 10 submarines waiting to spring into action. The leader of the PQ-17 escort, Captain Jackie Broom, lined his convoy up into 9 columns spaced at 1,000 meters, each one composed of 4 cargo ships sailing 400 meters apart. The rectangular shape formed by the cargo ships in the convoy, which was much wider than it was long, was intended to make things harder for attackers that might approach from the flank. The close escort acted as a barrier. The anti-aircraft forces were positioned some 1,000 meters from the convoy, and the other escort ships were 3,000 meters away. In the Arctic, heavily loaded cargo ships could travel no faster than 10 knots, so the PQ-17 convoy would have to sail at the speed of the slowest ship, around 20 kilometers per hour. This made them easy targets for the German air forces and navy.
But on July 2nd, Adolf Hitler authorized the launch of a vast naval campaign, Operation Rosselsprung. He directed his naval forces, including the Tirpitz, to the Arctic Sea to destroy the PQ-17 convoy.
Three airplanes were now surveying the PQ-17 convoy. On the ships, the sailors waited in fear of the inevitable attack. The German submarine U-456 attempted to strike but was held off by 4 escort ships. The anti-submarine barrier worked perfectly. At 6 o'clock on the evening of July 2nd, 1942, 8 HE-115 seaplanes made an unsuccessful attack on the convoy. One of them was brought down. The anti-aircraft barrier also proved to be very effective.
The escort did its job perfectly. On July 3rd, a fog so thick you could cut it with a knife fell on the convoy. Usually that makes for difficult sailing conditions, but in this case, it was a godsend for the sailors because it made them completely invisible.
The reconnaissance airplanes disappeared. The subs that were tracking the convoy lost all trace of them. The sailors were relieved. They hoped the fog would never lift. What they didn't know was that on that same July 3rd, a British reconnaissance airplane had noticed the Tirpitz was no longer anchored where it had been. It had simply disappeared. In London, the heads of the Royal Navy were asking themselves where the largest battleship in Europe could have gone. Was it headed for the PQ-17 convoy? By dawn on the 4th of July, the convoy had traveled more than 2/3 of the way to Murmansk, but it was reaching the Barents Sea, which was under complete control of the German forces.
The weather on July 4th was magnificent. The sky was clear blue, and you could see for kilometers. Normally, this would be a good thing, but for the sailors of the PQ-17 convoy, it was the worst thing that could happen. Instead of remaining invisible, they were now like sitting ducks.
The captain of the American cruiser Wichita, on which actor Douglas Fairbanks Jr. was serving, sent a message to Captain Broom, the leader of the close escort. The 4th of July is a day for fireworks. I hope you don't disappoint us. He wouldn't be disappointed. A few hours later, the PQ-17 convoy was spotted by a German reconnaissance plane. The airstrike began shortly after noon. During one attack, the American destroyer Wainwright stood out from the rest. The ship split off from the others and headed towards the airplanes at top speed. Once it was within range, it did a rapid turn at 60 kilometers per hour, thus presenting its flank and shooting all of its guns at once. The torpedo bombers were faced with a barrage of fire so dense, they were shooting blindly.
When the Wainwright returned to position in the convoy, it was given a standing ovation by the sailors on the ships they passed by, as the crew members clapped and congratulated them on what they had done.
The counterattack from the American destroyer was fairly successful. One airplane was brought down, but the German Air Force still managed to sink 2 commercial ships. Nevertheless, the convoy remained in formation and continued on their way. Meanwhile, in England, Admiral Pound, the first Sea Lord, was baffled. Where was the Tirpitz? Pound was faced with a dilemma. If the German battleship was headed for the PQ-17 convoy, the cruisers and torpedo ships escorting it couldn't even hope to hit it, and would undoubtedly all be sunk. If the distant escort composed of the HMS Duke of York, the USS Washington, and the victorious aircraft carrier tried to block the Tirpitz's advance, they would be under threat of attack by air, and therefore also at risk of being sunk. If they went looking for the Tirpitz in the Norwegian Sea and didn't find it there, the German battleship and its escort could take advantage of the opportunity to carry out a raid in the Atlantic, posing a lasting threat to the convoys between the US and England. So what was he to do?
Finally, Lord Pound made a decision, which would turn out to be the worst decision of his life.
At 9:11 that evening, the Admiralty radioed the captain of the close escort of the PQ-17, Captain Broom. The convoy must scatter and head to the Russian ports.
12 minutes later, another message arrived ordering the convoy to scatter. Then a third message came in telling the cruisers to pull back quickly to the west. This caused some panic. Why? Because the sailors were sure the Germans were about to attack.
The first Sea Lord, the admiral of the fleet, ordered all surface ships in the convoy to fall back to a specific spot. In other words, they were to abandon the convoy.
Even though they hadn't received any specific orders, the destroyers and 3 of the 4 armed trawlers followed the cruisers as they suddenly split off. But on board the Ayrshire trawler, Leo Gradwell refused to abandon his mission to protect the convoy. He decided to stay with the abandoned cargo ships. It was meager consolation for the civilian sailors. The crew on the commercial ships watched in astonishment as their escorts sailed off to the west. It was 10:15 at night, and in accordance with their orders, the other ships scattered with a heavy heart.
The captain of the Keppel, one of the destroyers that was escorting the convoy, sent a message to the captains of the cargo ships he was leaving behind, basically saying that he was sorry to abandon them. He wished them luck, and then he said that he felt like they would be in for a rough time of it.
near midnight. The German submarine U-456, which had found the convoy thanks to the good weather and endless daylight, reported the good news that the cargo ships of the PQ-17 had no more escort, and the scramble could begin. In the scope of 9 days, the German subs and airplanes sank no fewer than 25 cargo ships, 11 of them on July 5th alone. 2 were sunk the next day, 4 on July 7th, 1 on July 8th, and 3 between July 10th and 13th.
It was July 1942. The Red Army had just suffered terrible defeats. They took heavy losses near Kharkov. The Germans had taken Crimea, and Sebastopol was about to fall. For us, at that moment in time, every tank, every liter of fuel, every drop, and every airplane was worth its weight in gold. When the order came in to split up the convoy, I have no words to describe what it meant. It was more than demoralizing. It was a tragedy for all Soviets. The destruction of that convoy caused the death of thousands of us.
But Leo Gradwell would soon save the honor of the British Navy. After heading northwards using a simple pocket atlas, he took under his protection 3 of the forsaken cargo ships, guiding them into the ice fields, where the trawlers struggled to open up a path before stopping the convoy in the middle of nowhere.
Leo Gradwell then made a decision that might be difficult to believe. In order to raise morale, he decided to give his men double rations. Then he chose to camouflage his convoy by requisitioning some white paint from one of the cargo ships and ordering the southern face of all of the ships to be painted white. He also put white sheets on all the superstructures, so the ships would blend into the scenery. They were like so many icebergs in the middle of the ice field. He had all the lights turned off and requested that the gun turrets on the tanks that certain ships were carrying be turned to the south in case the Germans attacked.
Gradwell waited for 3 days, listening to the radio at all times. He waited with a heavy heart until he stopped receiving SOS calls from the other lost ships. On the evening of July 7th, the 4 surviving ships extracted themselves from the ice and headed back out to sea, eventually reaching the port of Arkhangelsk, safe and sound on July 24th, 17 days later. Other sailors from the PQ-17 convoy also managed to survive against the odds, such as the 46 crew members of the Washington cargo ship, which sank on July 5th. Out of fear of being sunk again, they refused to be saved by the American cargo ship Olopana, which was indeed sunk just a few days later. Instead, they rowed 300 nautical miles, more than 480 kilometers, to reach the coast of Nova Zemlya on July 12th. Braving snowstorms, hunger, thirst, and despair, there they found other cargo ships that had miraculously survived the air attacks and were preparing to head to Arkhangelsk by way of the 35-kilometer strait, the White Sea Throat, where the German U-boats commonly patrolled, just a half-hour flight from Norway.
The 46 sailors from the Washington reached Arkhangelsk on July 25th, 20 days after their ship had been sunk. In the meantime, the Russians had obviously organized expeditions to try to save the crews of the ships that had been sunk, notably in the Strait of the White Sea.
Three more ships were sunk in this strait, bringing the total number of lost PQ-17 ships to 26, including 24 commercial ships. 153 sailors lost their lives.
We received an order to go in search of the transports and escort them to Arkhangelsk, Molotovsk, and Murmansk.
We saved a lot of people, including some 40 who had been abandoned at sea during the crossing of the PQ-17.
And about all they could say was, it was rather rough, it was rather cold, and we survived. But they never said much about it, yeah?
Along with the ships of the PQ-17, 430 tanks ended up at the bottom of the Barents Sea. In July 1942 in Stalingrad, the Red Army had just 400 tanks. The 210 aircraft lost with the PQ-17 convoy were equivalent to 1/3 of the air forces that were operating above the Soviet city in July 1942. The USSR didn't receive the 3,500 cars either, which was 1,000 more than they had in Stalingrad at the time. Between July 9th and July 11th, 5 cargo ships from the PQ-17 convoy reached Arkhangelsk. No one could believe that just 14% of the convoy ships had survived the crossing. Everyone kept hoping. In the weeks that followed, 6 more ships would reach Arkhangelsk. Of the 35 cargo ships that had originally set out with the PQ-17 convoy from Iceland, only 11 reached the Soviet coast. The surviving sailors were bitter. They felt they had been abandoned by the British Navy.
Then we learned that the admiral in charge of the operation had simply abandoned the ships, telling them it was every man for himself.
Today, Pound's message ordering the convoy to scatter and the destroyers and cruisers to fall back sounds crazy, especially because we now know that the Tirpitz' mission ended on July 5th, which was practically the same day. And in fact, the Russian fleet was still searching for it in the Barents Sea at the time.
We were stationed in Vainga, and we received orders to sail towards the Tirpitz, which was supposed to be out at sea, sinking the cargo ships one by one. We were meant to sail out to meet the Tirpitz and fight it. Every half hour, the captain reported how far we were from the Tirpitz. And then one day, we were suddenly informed that the Tirpitz had changed directions, and we were heading back to port.
In reality, the Tirpitz had made only a few rounds off the coast of Norway. To the German Navy, sending a battleship to chase down and sink commercial ships made no sense. But the Germans had also noticed that the British cruisers and destroyers had abandoned the convoy. The Tirpitz had been spotted by the Allied air forces. There seemed to be a real threat. The British Navy could have had substantial forces in the area, and Hitler was constantly issuing warnings to be careful out of fear of losing the second jewel of his naval forces. But the Germans celebrated. The PQ-17 convoy disaster was proof of their control over the region of the Barents Sea. They saw this total victory as a demonstration of bravura and coordination between the naval and air forces. The British Admiralty reached an inevitable conclusion. With the combined actions of its surface fleet, submarines, and aircraft, Germany was capable of cutting off the Arctic route during the long summer months. On July 27, 1942, Churchill told Stalin that the convoys would be temporarily stopped.
When that happened, Stalin became very angry. He issued a not-so-diplomatic response to Churchill, essentially telling him that his experts found the Allies to be lacking willingness to carry out their duty, and that they were not meeting their obligations to provide the Soviet Union with supplies. He also told them that his experts considered the decision to split up the PQ-17 convoy to be very foolish. He finished by saying, "No major task can be carried out in wartime without risk or losses."
Finding himself in the midst of a diplomatic crisis as war continued to rage on, Churchill traveled to Moscow for an Allied conference. Upon his return, he announced that the convoys would be resuming. And so, PQ-18 set off to sea. But this time, the Allies were powerfully prepared. They modified their route and added an aircraft carrier, the HMS Avenger, to its escort. On September 2nd, the PQ-18 convoy sailed off with the most impressive escort ever seen: 51 battleships for 40 cargo ships. On September 8th, the convoy was spotted. On the 13th, the Luftwaffe threw all its forces into battle. 85 torpedo bombers approached the convoy head-on, skimming the waves. They were spaced 150 meters apart in what was known as the Golden Comb tactic. They launched 140 torpedoes as they simultaneously headed for the convoy. Six cargo ships were hit, including 2 carrying ammo. They disintegrated instantly, making a deafening noise. One attack came after another, up until the entrance to the Strait of the White Sea. There, the German pilots attempted one last assault. But 2 Soviet destroyers had come to reinforce the escort.
Our captain, Antoine Losivovich Gurin, had us fire our main guns. Since they were flying at low altitude, we could shoot them easily. The airplanes were peppered with 130mm shells. I don't want to speak incorrectly, but we brought down at least 2 or 3 airplanes in that battle.
The tragedy of the PQ-17 was not to be repeated. The Germans managed to sink 13 ships, but this tactical success came at a very high cost. 41 Luftwaffe planes were brought down, and 5 Kriegsmarine subs were sunk. Of the 40 cargo ships of the PQ-18 convoy, 27 reached the Soviet ports.
What the German strategists didn't understand was that they were only victorious over PQ-17 because it had no escort. The PQ-18 convoy was much less vulnerable. Yes, some ships were sunk, but the Germans also suffered great losses. They should have gotten the Tirpitz and its escort ships involved. But Hitler didn't want to do that. Why? Because he didn't want to take the risk of losing the Tirpitz, which would have had a dangerous psychological impact on the German people. He also preferred to keep his commercial ships in case the Allies decided to land in Norway.
Protected by powerful escorts, the convoys could make it through with minimal losses. The supplies they were carrying were vital for the Red Army. They would save the lives of Soviet soldiers and contribute to their eventual triumph. Later in the war, the British Admiralty made sure to avoid any more tragedies like that of the PQ-17 convoy. The Allied ships took the upper hand, and the attacks on the following convoys in December of 1942 and 1943 were a debacle for the German fleet. The heavy cruisers of the Kriegsmarine would never be able to outclass the cruisers and destroyers of the Royal Navy.
On January 6, 1943, Hitler was so furious that he asked for his whole surface fleet to be sent to the junkyard.
Hitler was right to be worried. In the northern Atlantic, the game was almost up. As Allied air coverage extended, their ships were equipped with radar and the convoys were protected by escort aircraft carriers. They were less and less vulnerable to attack. Over the course of 1943, a number of Allied ships arrived safe and sound in the Soviet ports. By this time, the Russian soldiers had already won the Battle of Stalingrad. By the end of the war, 2,795 tanks, 1,960 airplanes, 22,000 vehicles, and 527,000 tons of ammunition had been transported by the Arctic Convoys. But 4 million tons of supplies, 67 ships, and 3,000 lives were also lost.
In the grand scheme of things, the Arctic convoys didn't transport all that much in terms of supplies, but they played a crucial role, delivering these supplies to the right place at the right time.
The Soviet government eventually managed to move most of its factories behind the protective barrier of the Ural Mountains. With just a few months, industrial production began once again. Yet Stalin still insisted on continuing the convoys. There were two reasons for that. The first was that no matter what they said, the Red Army was in dire need of supplies. And the second reason was that the convoys had a highly symbolic value.
If we hadn't have done it, we would never have won the war. And I hate to think what would have happened.